Think about that morning. Your coffee hadn't even gone cold yet, and in a single second, the entire internet went dark. Not a hack, not a technical failure. Something else. 7:14 a.m., Greenwich Mean Time. Every radar station on Earth triggered its alarm simultaneously. Every satellite lost its signal at once. Every aircraft currently in the air, their pilots watched their instruments freeze mid-reading, like time itself had stuttered, like the universe had skipped a frame. And then they looked up. They weren't ships. Not the way we imagine ships. No flying saucers. No blinking lights. No Hollywood nonsense. They were structures. That's the closest word. Imagine taking an entire city, buildings, towers, elevated plazas, sprawling infrastructure, lifting a hole into space and letting it breathe, because they were breathing. They were moving, not flying, not hovering, existing, deliberately, intentionally. Above us, 13 structures, positioned just beyond Earth's upper atmosphere, and their shadows, their combined shadows, draped across all of Europe like a burial shroud. Commander Lena Vasquez was in New York that morning. She was attending the UN Emergency Council's weekly briefing. Routine agenda. Forgettable. She had a cold coffee to her left and a half-filled notepad to her right. She was writing something when the officer beside her dropped her phone. Then both their phones died. Then the building's primary power went out. Then the backup generators. And then deep, slow, resonant, a sound arrived. Not through the walls. Not through the floor. Not through any speaker or vent or crack in the ceiling. It came from inside, like something had reached through the air itself and pressed a finger directly against the surface of every human mind in the building. Inhabitants of the third planet, you have been assessed. You have been found insufficient. Prepare for transition. That was it. No elaboration. No introduction. No declaration of war. Just transition. The word hung in the air like smoke. Clinical. Detached. The kind of word you use when you're moving furniture. When you're clearing a shelf to make room for something more important. They didn't say destroy. They didn't say surrender. They said transition, because to them, humanity wasn't an enemy. It was an inconvenience. The council chamber was absolutely silent. 35 people, some of the most powerful human beings alive. Generals with decades of command experience. Intelligence directors who had dismantled entire networks with a phone call. Diplomats who had talked their way out of wars. All of them frozen. But Lena picked up her notepad, and she started writing. Signal source, omnidirectional. Language, synthesized from our own transmissions, likely pulled from broadcast history. Tone, dismissive, not aggressive. No ultimatum deadline given. Conclusion, they do not fear us. She paused. Her pen hovered. Then she added one more word. Yet. And she underlined it. Twice. That same night, one of the 13 structures descended. Slowly. Without urgency. The way a surgeon lowers a scalpel, not rush, because rushing would imply doubt. It settled above New York. Low enough that you could see its surface from the streets below. Smooth? Dark. The color of deep space itself. No seams. No bolts. No visible joins. A single continuous surface, like something grown rather than built. Like bone. Like a shell. A circular opening appeared in its base. Perfect. Deliberate. And something stepped out. It looked almost human. Almost. Height. Significant. 7 feet, perhaps more. Lean in a way that felt architectural rather than biological, like something had taken a human skeleton and refined it past the point of comfort. Its coloring didn't exist in any clean category. Not gray, not blue, not dark. It simply absorbed light differently than anything else in the scene. And its eyes moved independently, simultaneously tracking 3 separate directions at once. This was Commander Zetael, 5th-tier commander of the Vorkai High Fleet. He had personally overseen the capitulation of roughly 400 civilizations across 6 star systems. He had heard every kind of plea, every kind of bargain, every desperate, dignified, broken attempt at negotiation a species could produce before finally going quiet. He had never hesitated. Not once. But when Zetael descended into the open space before the UN building, where 13,000 humans had gathered, spilling across every street, every ledge, every rooftop in sight. He stopped. One step from the bottom of the ramp. 1 second. Just one. Later, when analysts pulled the footage and ran it at 0.3x speed, they noticed something that the live broadcast had missed entirely. ZAO wasn't scanning the crowd. He was reading it, moving his gaze from face to face to face, methodically, like he was searching for a specific data point and couldn't locate it, like the answer he expected. The answer 400 civilizations had always given him wasn't there, and it wasn't. There was no mass terror on those faces. Some people were crying, but not from fear, from grief, perhaps, from the weight of what this moment meant. Some were angry. Some were recording on phones that somehow still worked. Some were holding signs. Some were holding their children up high so they could see. But the overwhelming majority of those 13,000 faces carried something that I had no clean category for. They were curious, alert, calculating, present, like this wasn't the end of something, like this was the beginning of a problem. And problems, to these creatures, were apparently something you solved. And in that single second, ZAO's eyes widened, just slightly, just a fraction of a degree, the Vorkai equivalent of a full-body recoil. The cameras caught it. It lasted less than a quarter of a second, but it was there. Fear. He didn't know why. He couldn't have explained it to his high council if they had asked. He had stood before dying civilizations. He had watched species weep and rage and collapse. He was not afraid of any of those things. But this, a species that looked at their own extinction with the eyes of engineers. This was something he had never encountered in 400 worlds. And the part of him that had kept him alive through 6 star systems of war recognized it immediately, even before his mind could name it. Danger. Lena Vasquez was standing in the front row. She had pushed her way there 20 minutes before Zadael appeared, not out of bravado, out of the same instinct that made her take notes when everyone else went silent. She saw his eyes widen. She saw the fraction of a second tell, and she wrote one final line in her notepad before the formal proceedings began. He's afraid. He doesn't know why yet. Good. We need him asking that question before we answer it. The sky hadn't cracked that morning. It had opened, and what had come through was about to make the single greatest strategic miscalculation in the history of this galaxy. It had looked at humanity, wounded, divided, technologically outmatched, standing on a planet that had spent 10,000 years tearing itself apart, and it had seen something small. It had not yet understood what small things do when you corner them. It had not yet understood what happens when you tell a species that has survived ice ages, plagues, world wars, and its own worst impulses, that it is insufficient. You don't end them. You wake them up. There's a specific kind of silence. Your coffee hadn't even gone cold yet. When everyone in a single second, that one entire internet is about to carry something no human being should ever have to carry alone. That silence fell over the UN Emergency Council at 6:47 a.m. Every radar station on Earth and every eye in that room was on Lena Vasquez. Every satellite decision hadn't been democratic. Every aircraft had been timed for democracy. There hadn't been a vote, their instruments, committees mid-reading, a careful deliberation time itself had stuttered, subcommittees, like the universe had skipped a frame, and 3 rounds of revision. They looked. There had been 7 hours of screaming arguments, not the way we imagined. 2 near fistfights between military advisors from opposing nations, no blinking and lights, one very quiet no AI analysis delivered at 4 a.m. They reviewed every available human negotiator, diplomat, imagine taking entire psychologists and buildings, towers, elevated plazas. The AI and infrastructure. Lena Vasquez was first, and letting it by a margin that made the second-place candidate look like a footnote. Not because she was the most decorated, not because she had the most experience, intentionally, not because she had the right political connections, 13 structures, or the most impressive position just beyond Earth's upper atmosphere. Because of one thing the AI had flagged in her psych evaluation from 11 years prior, draped across all of Europe, a single line buried in page 43, Commander Lena Vasquez assessment was a New Subject demonstrates an unusual. She was attending the UN Emergency Council's weekly briefing, where most individuals showed elevated fear forgettable. Subject shows elevated pattern recognition and a half-filled notepad to her right. She was writing something followed in the office on the side her dropped her phone. They were following up both now. Their phones died. Lena had grown up in the building's primary power. Columbia went out, not then the backup generators. The
and
real
then deep,
one, slow,
she was
resonant.
9 years old when
sound
the building
arrived,
across the street from her
not
school
through the walls,
was destroyed
not
in
through
a
the
conflict.
Not through any
She was
speaker
too young
or
to
vent
fully
or
understand,
crack in the
but
ceiling.
old enough to never
It came
forget.
from inside.
She remembered
like
the
something
sound
had reached
more
through
than
the
anything
air
else,
itself, and
not
pressed
the
a finger
explosion
directly
itself,
against the surface.
the silence
of
after
every
it,
human
the
mind
way the
in the
world
building.
went completely
Inhabitants
quiet
of the
for
third
3
planet.
full seconds
been
before the
assessed.
screaming started.
You've been found.
She had sat in that
insufficient.
classroom,
Prepare for transition.
covered in glass dust.
That was it.
And done
No
something her
elaboration.
teacher would talk about for
No
the rest of her
introduction.
life. She
No
had picked up her
declaration of
pencil
war.
and started
Just
drawing a
transition.
map. The
Not
word
of
hung in the
destruction,
air like
of
smoke.
the street.
Clinical,
Of where the people were.
detached,
Of where
the
the
kind of
exits
word
were.
you use when
Of
you're
where
moving
help
furniture.
needed to go.
When you're clearing
She
a
was
shelf to
9
make
years
room for
old,
something
and
more
she was
important. Already
They didn't
solving.
say destroy.
That was
They
Lena
didn't say
Vasquez.
surrender.
That had
They said
always been
transition,
Lena Vasquez.
because to
them,
she had rebuilt
humanity
herself
wasn't
through
an
scholarships
enemy.
and stubbornness.
It was an inconvenience.
Through universities that didn't
the
want
council
her,
chamber
and to her test
was
scores left them
absolutely
no
silent.
choice.
35
Through military
people,
service that
some of
tried
the
to
most
grind her
powerful
edges
human
smooth
beings
and
alive.
failed completely.
Generals
She
with
had survived
decades of
things that
command
would have
experience.
permanently broken people.
Intelligence
with far
directors who
easier
had
starting
dismantled
points.
entire networks
She was
with
not
a phone
fearless.
call.
That's the
Diplomats
important
who had
part.
talked their way
She
out
was
of
not
wars.
fearless.
All of
She
them
simply never let
frozen.
fear sit.
But Lena
drive
picked up
her
a
seat.
notepad.
They gave her
and
30
she
minutes
started
to
writing.
prepare. 30
Signal
minutes
source.
to prepare to speak on behalf
Language.
of every human being
Synthesized
who
from
has
our
ever lived,
own
or was
transmissions,
currently living,
likely
or would ever
pulled
live
from
on
broadcast
Earth.
history.
She spent the
Tone
first 10 minutes
dismissive,
reading
not aggressive.
every piece of data
No
the intelligence
ultimatum
teams had
deadline
compiled
given.
on the Vorkai
Conclusion.
overnight.
They do not
She
fear
spent the
us.
next 10 minutes
She
sitting
paused.
completely
Her
still
pen
with her
hovered.
eyes closed.
Then she added one
which
more
made
word.
3 separate
Yet.
generals deeply
And she
uncomfortable.
underlined it.
And she spent the
Twice.
final 10 minutes
That
writing
same night,
7 words
one of the
on a
13
fresh
structures
page
of a
descended,
notepad,
slowly,
and staring at them.
without urgency.
She didn't show anyone
the way
what
a
she'd
surgeon
written.
lowers a scalpel.
She tore the
not
page out,
rush,
folded
because
it,
rushing would imply
and
doubt.
put it in her jacket
It settled
pocket.
above New York.
Then she stood up and
low
said,
enough that you can
"Let's
see its
go."
surface from the streets below.
The chamber they
Smooth,
used wasn't
dark,
inside the UN
the color
building.
of deep space
ZAL
itself.
had transmitted
No
specific
seams,
coordinates.
no bolts,
A flat
no
open
visible
space near the
joins.
Hudson River.
A single
Cleared overnight
continuous
by a
surface,
combination of military
like something
coordinates
grown
and
rather than
silence that
built.
had fallen
Like
over
bone,
New York like a second
shell.
atmosphere.
A circular
no
opening
traffic
appeared in its base.
No sirens.
Perfect.
The city that
deliberate,
never sleeps
and
had gone
something stepped
completely
out.
still.
It looked
As
almost
if
human.
even the buildings were
Almost.
holding their breath.
Height.
A
Significant.
temporary structure
7
had been
feet,
erected,
perhaps more.
minimal,
Two
lean in a
chairs
way that
facing
felt
each other across a
architectural
low
rather than
table.
biological.
No flags.
Like something had
no
taken a
insignia.
human skeleton.
ZAL
and
had
refined it
specified.
past the point of comfort.
No symbols of
Its
hierarchy.
coloring didn't exist.
That
and
specification
any clean
alone
category
had
told Lena something
not
important.
gray, not
He
blue,
thinks
not
hierarchy
dark.
is a
It
weakness.
simply absorbed light
He
differently
thinks
than
symbols
anything
are a
else he's
crutch.
seen.
He thinks
it's
he's
eyes.
already won.
Its
Good.
eyes moved
Let him think
independently.
that.
Simultaneously
first.
tracking 3
ZAL
separate
was
directions at
already
once.
seated.
This
For
was
Vorkai
Commander
attendant
ZAL,
stood behind him,
fifth-tier commander
motionless,
of the Vorkai High
identical
Fleet.
in posture.
He had personally
like
overseen the
load-bearing
capitulation
columns in a
of
cathedral.
roughly 400
The air inside
civilizations
the structure
across
felt
6
different,
star systems.
slightly thicker.
He had heard
The
every
temperature
kind
was
of
lower
plea,
by several degrees.
every kind of bargain,
and there was a faint
every
sound
desperate,
below hearing
dignified,
range. Felt
broken
more in the
attempt
chest
at
and negotiation.
ears.
A species
like
could
the
produce
distant
before
vibration of
finally
something
going
enormous
quiet.
idling.
He had just
never
out of sight.
hesitated.
Lena sat
Not
down.
once.
But when
placed her
ZAL
notepad
descended
on the
into
table,
open space before
she put
the
her
UN
pen
building,
beside it,
and
where
she looked directly at
13,000 humans
ZAL.
had gathered.
He looked back,
spilling across
for 11
every street,
seconds.
Every
Neither of them
ledge,
said anything.
every rooftop
Then
in
ZAL
sight.
spoke. He stopped.
Not through the air
One
to
step
mind
from the bottom
transmission
of the
from
ramp.
yesterday.
1 second.
But through a physical
Just
vocalization.
Later,
At the translation
when
system
analysts pulled the
converted
footage
in
and
real
ran it
time,
at 0.3x
his voice
speed, they
translated
noticed something that
was
the live
flat,
broadcast
precise,
had missed entirely.
like a legal document
ZAL
being
wasn't
read
scanning
aloud
the crowd.
by someone who
He was
found legal
reading it,
documents
moving
boring.
his gaze
You
from
represent
face
your
to face to
species.
face,
I
methodically,
do,
like
Lena
he was
said.
searching for a
You
specific
understand your
data
position
point and couldn't
Tell me our
locate it.
position,
like the
Lena
answer he
said.
expected.
I want to hear you say
The
it.
answer 400
pause.
civilizations had
Brief.
always given him.
The first crack
wasn't there.
Your civilization
wasn't.
is at
There
technological
was no mass
stage
terror on those
4.2
faces.
on
Some
the
people were
Vorkai
crying,
Development
but
Index.
not from fear.
The threshold
from
for
grief,
species preservation
perhaps,
consideration
from
is
the weight
stage
of what
7.
this moment
You
meant.
do not
Some were
qualify for
angry.
negotiation.
Some were
under
recording on
standard
phones
protocol.
that somehow
This
still
meeting is a
worked.
courtesy.
Some were holding
A courtesy minds. Some were holding their children up
not
high,
mocking,
so they
genuinely
could see.
noting.
But the overwhelming majority of
412
those civilizations have received the
faces
same
carrying
something
courtesy.
that I had no
All have
clean
accepted the
category
terms
for.
of transition.
They were curious.
What happened to them?
Alert.
Lena
Calculating.
After
Present.
transition,
Like this was
they
the
were
end of something.
repurposed.
Like this
Their
was the beginning of
biological
problem.
material was preserved
And
were
problems
viable.
to these
Their
creatures
planetary resources
were apparently something you
redistributed.
solved.
Several of
And
their
in that
cultural
single
records
second,
were
Zathael's
archived,
eyes widened.
repurposed, just
Like
slightly,
furniture,
just
like
a fraction
land,
of a degree,
like something that
the
had no
Vorkai
opinion
equivalent of a full
about what
body
happened to it.
recoil.
Lena
The cameras
wrote
caught
one word in
It
her notepad.
lasted less than a quarter
She
of a
didn't look
second,
down when she
but it
wrote
was
it.
there.
She kept
Fear.
her eyes on Zeta
He didn't
the
know
entire
why.
time. He couldn't have explained it to his high council if they had asked. He had stood before dying civilizations. He had watched species weep and rage and collapse. He was not afraid of any of those things. But this, a species that looked at their own extinction with the eyes of engineers. This was something he had never encountered in 400 worlds. And the part of him that had kept him alive through 6 star systems of war recognized it immediately, even before his mind could name it. Danger. Lena Vasquez was standing in the front row. She had pushed her way there 20 minutes before Zadale appeared, not out of bravado, out of the same instinct that made her take notes when everyone else went silent. She saw his eyes widen. She saw the fraction of a second tell, and she wrote one final line in her notepad before the formal proceedings began. He's afraid. He doesn't know why yet. Good. We need him asking that question before we answer it. The sky hadn't cracked that morning. It had opened, and what had come through was about to make the single greatest strategic miscalculation in the history of this galaxy. It had looked at humanity, wounded, divided, technologically outmatched, standing on a planet that had spent 10,000 years tearing itself apart, and it had seen something small. It had not yet understood what small things do when you corner them. It had not yet understood what happens when you tell a species that has survived ice ages, plagues, world wars, and its own worst impulses, that it is insufficient. You don't end them. You wake them up. It happened at 6:47 in the morning. Most of the city was still asleep. That was not an accident. The Vorkai had calculated optimal strike timing with the same cold precision they applied to everything. Maximum psychological impact, minimum military resistance. A sleeping city, a waking world, the perfect audience for a demonstration. The target was Karachi. 22 million people, one of the largest port cities on Earth. Strategically significant enough to carry weight, civilian enough to carry horror. The Vorkai didn't send a fleet. They didn't launch missiles or drop bombs in any form humanity would recognize. One of the 13 structures simply tilted, just slightly, just enough, and from its underside, something descended that had no name in any human language because no human had ever needed to name it before. It looked, from a distance, like light, beautiful, almost rose gold and slow-moving, like sunrise condensed into a column. It touched the city center at 6:47 a.m. and 14 seconds. By 6:48 a.m., 200,000 people were gone, not destroyed, not burned, not collapsed under rubble that rescue teams could later sift through. Gone, as if the space they had occupied had simply been revised. The world woke up to silence where a city had been. Not rubble, not fire, not the chaotic, horrible, human wreckage of conventional destruction that news cameras had documented across 100 years of warfare. Those images, as devastating as they were, carried within them some kind of familiar grammar. You could look at them and grieve in a way you understood. This was different. The satellite feeds showed a clean absence. Buildings standing at the edges, roads intact at the perimeter, and then a perfect circle, roughly 12 kilometers in diameter, where everything inside it had simply stopped existing. No smoke, no sound, no bodies to recover, just a circle of bare earth, slightly darker than the soil around it, as if something had pressed down and then lifted away. 200,000 people had been in that circle. 200,000 people who had been sleeping or making breakfast or getting children ready for school or walking to work in the early quiet of a coastal morning. Gone. The global reaction happened in phases. The first phase lasted approximately 4 minutes, and it was pure animal, wordless shock. Every broadcast network on the planet went to the same images. Every social media feed filled with the same satellite footage. 11 languages, 1 image, 0 words adequate to describe it. The second phase, the phase the Vorkai had calculated for, the phase their entire tactical doctrine had been built around, should have been collapse. Capitulation, the reaching out, the desperate communication of species that had just understood, in the most visceral possible way, that it was outmatched, that the thing above them was not negotiating, that the word transition had a specific, terrible meaning, and they had just seen it applied. 400 civilizations had reached this phase. 400 civilizations had made the same choice, because the choice was logical. because the math was brutal and simple and undeniable. You cannot fight what you cannot touch. You cannot resist what you cannot understand. You cannot win against something that erases you from a distance without effort and without malice, the way you might wipe dust from a shelf. The second phase should have been surrender. It was not surrender. What happened instead happened so fast, and so completely, and so simultaneously across every nation and culture and language group on Earth that the Vorkai censor team spent the next 6 hours trying to model it and failed every time. Within 90 minutes of the strike, every major government on Earth, including 3 that had been in active military conflict with each other for the previous 8 years, had opened direct communication lines, not negotiation channels, not diplomatic protocols, command channels, military command channels. The kind you open when you are coordinating an operation, not when you are talking about one. Within 3 hours, the UN Emergency Council had passed, unanimously and without a single abstention, Resolution 0, a document that had been drafted in theory 12 years earlier and stored in a sealed archive marked to be opened only if the unthinkable occurs. Resolution 0 transferred unified command authority of every military asset on Earth, every Navy, every Air Force, every ground unit, every intelligence apparatus, every satellite still functional, to a single combined operations structure. It had never been done before. Not once in the 10,000 years of human civilization had every nation on Earth placed its weapons in the same hands at the same moment. It took 3 hours and 11 minutes. And then the third thing happened. The thing the Vorkai couldn't model at all. People started showing up, not running, not evacuating. Showing up in Lagos and Sao Paulo and Jakarta, Mumbai and Chicago and Oslo. Ordinary people, not soldiers, not government officials, started appearing at military installations, at town halls, at community centers, at police stations. They weren't panicking. They weren't demanding to be saved. They were asking what they could do. Nurses who hadn't worked in years re-registering. Engineers showing up at aerospace facilities. Coders opening their laptops in parking lots outside classified buildings and posting their credentials on public forums with a message: I have skills. Tell me what you need. A 17-year-old in Seoul wrote a targeting algorithm in 11 hours that improved drone navigation by a factor of 4. She had never written military code before. She just understood the problem. And she solved it, because that is what humans do. ZAL received the censor reports and read them 3 times. He called Vel into a command room and placed the data on the central display without comment. Vel studied it for a long moment. His expression, insofar as Vorkai expressions communicated anything, was one of careful recalibration. They should be in collapse phase. Vel said, I know. Zedel said, the psychological modeling is... I know. 200,000 casualties is statistically above the threshold for... Vel. Zethael's voice was quiet, not angry. Something more unsettling than angry. I know what the model says. I'm looking at what's actually happening. Explain the difference. Vel couldn't. No Vorkai could. Because the Vorkai model of civilizational psychology was built on 400 data points. 400 species that had all responded to demonstration with the same fundamental architecture of despair. The model was excellent. The model was comprehensive. The model had never been wrong. The model had also never been tested against a species that had, over the course of its entire recorded history, responded to its worst moments by unifying. The Vorkai had never encountered a species whose deepest survival instinct wasn't to scatter, but to gather. Then Zedel did what he had done 412 times before. He opened a display, a hovering, luminous structure of data that materialized between them like a three-dimensional encyclopedia of conquest, world after world, species after species. The cold, clean record of everything the Vorkai had absorbed on their way to wherever they were going. He walked her through it methodically. The civilizations that had been centuries ahead of humanity technologically. The ones that had massive fleets, planetary defenses, weapons that made Earth's entire nuclear arsenal look like a child sparkler. All gone. All transitioned. He was making a point. He was making it thoroughly. He finished. He looked at her, waiting for the fear response. Waiting for the bargaining to begin. waiting for the part where they offered things, resources, cooperation, surrender with dignity, because that was always the part. That was always where it went. Lena was quiet for a moment. Then she asked her question. Not loudly, not dramatically. She asked it the way you ask something you genuinely want to know the answer to, conversationally, almost gently. Of the 412 civilizations you transitioned, how many of them knew you were coming? Zethael's translation system processed the question. He processed the question. His three-directional eyes made a movement, the Vorkai equivalent of a blink. Irrelevant, he said. How many? Lena said again. Same tone. No escalation. And the four attendant behind Zell, the motionless, column-still, perfectly controlled Vorkai attendants, shifted. Just slightly. Just enough. Because here was the thing. Here was the thing that Lena had worked out in those 30 minutes of preparation. Here was what was written on that folded piece of paper in her jacket pocket. The Vorkai had never lost. But the Vorkai had also never encountered a species that had watched them coming. Every civilization they had absorbed had been surprised. First contact and conquest had been functionally simultaneous. No warning, no preparation window. But humanity had spent the last 70 years broadcasting itself into space. Its fears, its stories, its obsession with this exact scenario. Hundreds of thousands of hours of fiction, philosophy, strategic theory, and paranoid contingency planning, all of it transmitted outward at the speed of light. The Vorkai hadn't just found humanity. They had studied humanity for decades before making contact, which meant humanity, in some indirect, chaotic, uncoordinated way, had been studied, had been known to be a potential contact, had been on someone's radar. And still, Earth had received a signal at 7:14 a.m. like a surprise, which meant someone on Earth had known, or suspected, and had prepared anyway. Project Ember. Lena didn't know its full scope yet. She had only heard the name once, whispered to her by a general who grabbed her arm as she was walking to the chamber this morning. He had leaned close. He had said 4 words. We are not unprepared. And then he had let go of her arm and walked away. She hadn't known what it meant yet, but she had known enough to ask the question. How many of them knew you were coming? Because whatever the answer was, 0 or 1 or none, humanity was about to be the first entry in that column that changed. And Zethael, sitting across from her in that chair, with his ancient eyes and his 400 conquests and his absolute certainty. He could feel it too. He just couldn't name it yet. The meeting ended 40 minutes later, without resolution. Zethael cited a need to consult his high council. He stood, he straightened, and as he turned to leave, just at the threshold, he paused. He turned back. He looked at Lena one more time. His eyes, all 3 directions of them, were focused on her. Just her. For the first time since they'd met, his gaze wasn't spreading across a room, cataloging, assessing multiple vectors simultaneously. He was looking at one thing. The way you look at something you cannot figure out. The way you look at a problem you don't yet have a solution for. Then he left. Lena sat alone in the chamber for 4 minutes after he was gone. Then she opened her notepad to the page she'd been writing on. And beneath everything else, she added one final line. He came in here to terrify me. He left afraid of the question. We're not done yet. We've barely started. She closed the notepad. She stood up. Outside, 8 billion people were waiting to find out if they had a future. She walked out into the pale morning light. And for the first time since 7:14 a.m. the previous day, she allowed herself one small, private, exhausted smile. Not because things were going well, but because they weren't going the way he had planned either. And in a war between a species that had never lost and a species that had never learned how to stay down, that gap, that small and fragile gap, was everything. If Lena's question sent a chill through you, you already understand what HFY means. Drop it in the comments. Let's build the wall of HFY together. Like this video, if you believe one human with the right question can change the course of a war. Lena was in the Ember Command node beneath Reykjavik when she received the data packet from the Combined Operations Center. She read it once, set it down, looked at the wall for a moment. Then she picked up the single communication device that could reach the Vorkai fleet's diplomatic channel. the channel ZL had established during their first meeting, the channel reserved for official human response. She had been thinking about this message for 3 days. Not its content, its length, because in every interaction she'd had with Zell, she had noticed something that his composed exterior almost completely concealed. He was, beneath the precision and the command authority in the 400 conquered worlds, a being that was used to having complete information, a being that was made profoundly, fundamentally uncomfortable by gaps, by things he couldn't fully read, by questions left unanswered. So she was not going to explain humanity's response to him. She was not going to justify it or defend it or frame it in terms he could categorize. She was going to give him the least information she possibly could and let the gap do its work. She recorded 3 words, sent them on the diplomatic channel, and closed the device. The 3 words were, "We remember everything." The Vorkai translation team received the message at 14:32 hours. They processed the linguistic components in seconds. The words themselves were simple. The syntax was clear. The transmission quality was perfect. But language is not just words. Language is context. Language is history. Language is the 10,000 years of experience that a species pours into 3 words to make them mean something that the words themselves technically do not contain. The translation team spent 6 hours running contextual analysis. We remember everything. Did it mean they had recorded the strike? Tactical intelligence about Vorkai capabilities? That seemed too simple. Did it mean they were referencing their own history? Their wars? Their losses? A promise of the kind that certain human cultural records suggested. That every debt was eventually settled? Did it mean something religious? Philosophical? Was it a declaration or a warning or a greeting in some context the Vorkai cultural database didn't contain? At the 6-hour mark, the lead translation analyst filed a report to ZAL. The report was 3 lines long. Linguistic content is clear. Contextual meaning cannot be determined with confidence. Recommend further data collection before strategic response. In 32 years of translation work across 47 species, she had never filed a report like that. She had never needed to. ZAL read the report. Read the 3-word message again. Looked at the sensor feeds showing humanity's impossible, illogical, infuriating unification, and felt something move through him that had no name in Vorkai language. Not fear exactly, not confusion exactly, something in between, something that existed in the space where his certainty used to be. He looked at Vel. "What are they building?" he asked quietly. Vel pulled up the sensor feeds. Scattered energy signatures. Underground activity on 3 continents. Submarine movements in the Pacific. Orbital repositioning of low-value satellite platforms. Nothing coherent, Vel said. Nothing that constitutes a threat profile we can model. Everything, ZAL said softly, almost to himself, constitutes a threat profile we can't model. He turned back to window, to the blue planet below him, to the species that had just lost 200,000 of its own, and responded by closing ranks, opening command channels, and sending him 3 words that his best analysts couldn't fully translate. He had given them a demonstration. They had given him a message. And the terrible, crawling, unprecedented thing he was feeling in this moment was the slowly dawning realization that he understood their message far less than they understood his. 200,000 people were gone, and the world did not break. The world sharpened. That was the moment the Vorkai should have understood what they were dealing with. That was the moment, if any of their models had been built for it, that their doctrine should have shifted from demonstration to full engagement. Because a species that sharpens in response to a wound is not a species that is losing. It is a species that is beginning. But the Vorkai didn't shift their doctrine, because in 400 conquests, they had never needed to. And that was the moment everything changed. 200,000 lives gone, and humanity answered with unity code, and 3 words no alien could fully translate. If that hits you somewhere deep, comment "We remember" below. Let the world see how many of us are standing. Like this video if you stand with humanity. Share it if you think this story deserves to be heard. It happened at 6:47 in the morning. Most of the city was still asleep. That was not an accident. The Vorkai had calculated optimal strike timing with the same cold precision they applied to everything. maximum psychological impact, minimum military resistance. A sleeping city, a waking world, the perfect audience for a demonstration. The target was Karachi, 22 million people, one of the largest port cities on Earth, strategically significant enough to carry weight, civilian enough to carry horror. The Vorkai didn't send a fleet. They didn't launch missiles or drop bombs in any form humanity would recognize. One of the 13 structures simply tilted, just slightly, just enough, and from its underside, something descended that had no name in any human language because no human had ever needed to name it before. It looked from a distance like light, beautiful, almost rose gold and slow-moving, like sunrise condensed into a column. It touched the city center at 6:47 a.m. and 14 seconds. By 6:48 a.m., 200,000 people were gone, not destroyed, not burned, not collapsed under rubble that rescue teams could later sift through. Gone, as if the space they had occupied had simply been revised. The world woke up to silence where a city had been. Not rubble, not fire, not the chaotic, horrible, human wreckage of conventional destruction that news cameras had documented across 100 years of warfare. Those images, as devastating as they were, carried within them some kind of familiar grammar. You could look at them and grieve in a way you understood. This was different. The satellite feeds showed a clean absence, buildings standing at the edges, roads intact at the perimeter, and then a perfect circle, roughly 12 kilometers in diameter, where everything inside it had simply stopped existing. No smoke, no sound, no bodies to recover, just a circle of bare earth, slightly darker than the soil around it, as if something had pressed down and then lifted away. 200,000 people had been in that circle. 200,000 people who had been sleeping or making breakfast or getting children ready for school or walking to work in the early quiet of a coastal morning. Gone. The global reaction happened in phases. The first phase lasted approximately 4 minutes, and it was pure animal, wordless shock. Every broadcast network on the planet went to the same images. Every social media feed filled with the same satellite footage. 11 languages, one image. 0 words adequate to describe it. The second phase, the phase the Vorkai had calculated for, the phase their entire tactical doctrine had been built around, should have been collapse, capitulation, the reaching out, the desperate communication of a species that had just understood, in the most visceral possible way, that was outmatched, that the thing above them was not negotiating, that the word transition had a specific, terrible meaning, and they had just seen it applied. 400 civilizations had reached this phase. 400 civilizations had made the same choice, because the choice was logical, because the math was brutal and simple and undeniable. You cannot fight what you cannot touch. You cannot resist what you cannot understand. You cannot win against something that erases you from a distance without effort and without malice, the way you might wipe dust from a shelf. The second phase should have been surrender. It was not surrender. What happened instead happened so fast, and so completely, and so simultaneously across every nation and culture and language group on Earth that the Vorkai Sensor team spent the next 6 hours trying to model it and failed every time. Within 90 minutes of the strike, every major government on Earth, including 3 that had been in active military conflict with each other for the previous 8 years, had opened direct communication lines, not negotiation channels, not diplomatic protocols, command channels, military command channels, the kind you open when you are coordinating an operation, not when you are talking about one. Within 3 hours, the UN Emergency Council had passed, unanimously and without a single abstention, Resolution 0, a document that had been drafted in theory 12 years earlier and stored in a sealed archive marked, to be open only if the unthinkable occurs. Resolution 0 transferred unified command authority of every military asset on Earth, every Navy, every Air Force, every ground unit, every intelligence apparatus, every satellite still functional, to a single combined operations structure. It had never been done before. Not once in the 10,000 years of human civilization had every nation on Earth placed its weapons in the same hands at the same moment. It took 3 hours and 11 minutes. And then the third thing happened. The The thing the Vorkai couldn't model at all. People started showing up, not running, not evacuating. Showing up in Lagos and Sao Paulo and Jakarta, Mumbai and Chicago and Oslo. Ordinary people, not soldiers, not government officials, started appearing at military installations, at town halls, at community centers, at police stations. They weren't panicking. They weren't demanding to be saved. They were asking what they could do. Nurses who hadn't worked in years re-registering. Engineers showing up at aerospace facilities. Coders opening their laptops in parking lots outside classified buildings and posting their credentials on public forums with a message. I have skills. Tell me what you need. A 17-year-old in Seoul wrote a targeting algorithm in 11 hours that improved drone navigation by a factor of 4. She had never written military code before. She just understood the problem. And she solved it, because that is what humans do. ZAL received the sensor reports and read them 3 times. He called Vel into the command room and placed the data on the central display without comment. Vel studied it for a long moment. His expression, insofar as Vorkai expressions communicated anything, was one of careful recalibration. They should be in collapse phase, Vel said. I know, Zadale said. The psychological modeling is... I know. 200,000 casualties is statistically above the threshold for... Vel. Zethael's voice was quiet, not angry. Something more unsettling than angry. I know what the model says. I'm looking at what's actually happening. Explain the difference. Vel couldn't. No Vorkai could. Because the Vorkai model of civilizational psychology was built on 400 data points. 400 species had all responded to demonstration with the same fundamental architecture of despair. The model was excellent. The model was comprehensive. The model had never been wrong. The model had also never been tested against a species that had, over the course of its entire recorded history, responded to its worst moments by unifying. The Vorkai had never encountered a species whose deepest survival instinct wasn't to scatter, but to gather. Lena was in the Ember Command node beneath Reykjavik when she received the data packet from the Combined Operations Center. She read it once, set it down, looked at the wall for a moment. Then she picked up the single communication device that could reach the Vorkai fleet's diplomatic channel. The channel Zedel had established during their first meeting. The channel reserved for official human response. She had been thinking about this message for 3 days. Not its content, its length, because in every interaction she'd had with Zell, she had noticed something that his composed exterior almost completely concealed. He was, beneath the precision and the command authority in the 400 conquered worlds, a being that was used to having complete information, a being that was made profoundly, fundamentally uncomfortable by gaps, by things he couldn't fully read, by questions left unanswered. So she was not going to explain humanity's response to him. She was not going to justify it or defend it or frame it in terms he could categorize. She was going to give him the least information she possibly could and let the gap do its work. She recorded 3 words, sent them on the diplomatic channel, and closed the device. The 3 words were, "We remember everything." The Vorkai translation team received the message at 14:32 hours. They processed the linguistic components in seconds. The words themselves were simple. The syntax was clear. The transmission quality was perfect. But language is not just words. Language is context. Language is history. Language is the 10,000 years of experience that a species pours into 3 words to make them mean something that the words themselves technically do not contain. The translation team spent 6 hours running contextual analysis. We remember everything. Did it mean they had recorded the strike? Tactical intelligence about Vorkai capabilities? That seemed too simple. Did it mean they were referencing their own history? Their wars? Their losses? A promise of the kind that certain human cultural records suggested. That every debt was eventually settled? Did it mean something religious? Philosophical? Was it a declaration, or a warning, or a greeting in some context the Vorkai cultural database didn't contain? At the 6-hour mark, the lead translation analyst filed a report to Zael. The report was 3 lines long. Linguistic content is clear. Contextual meaning cannot be determined with confidence. Recommend further data collection before strategic response. In 32 years of translation work across 47 species, she had never filed a report like that. She had never needed to. Zethael read the report. Read the 3-word message again. Looked at the sensor feeds showing humanity's impossible, illogical, infuriating unification, and felt something move through him that had no name in Vorkai language. Not fear exactly, not confusion exactly, something in between, something that existed in the space where his certainty used to be. He looked at Vel. What are they building? He asked quietly. Vel pulled up the sensor feeds. Scattered energy signatures. Underground activity on 3 continents. Submarine movements in the Pacific. Orbital repositioning of low-value satellite platforms. Nothing coherent, Vel said. Nothing that constitutes a threat profile we can model. Everything, Zethael said softly, almost to himself, constitutes a threat profile we can't model. He turned back to window, to the blue planet below him, to the species that had just lost 200,000 of its own, and responded by closing ranks, opening command channels, and sending him 3 words that his best analysts couldn't fully translate. He had given them a demonstration. They had given him a message. And the terrible, crawling, unprecedented thing he was feeling in this moment was the slowly dawning realization that he understood their message far less than they understood his. 200,000 people were gone, and the world did not break. The world sharpened. That was the moment the Vorkai should have understood what they were dealing with. That was the moment, if any of their models had been built for it, that their doctrine should have shifted from demonstration to full engagement. Because a species that sharpens in response to a wound is not a species that is losing. It is a species that is beginning. But the Vorkai didn't shift their doctrine, because in 400 conquests, they had never needed to. And that was the moment everything changed. 200,000 lives. Gone. And humanity answered with unity, code, and 3 words no alien could fully translate. If that hits you somewhere deep, comment "We remember" below. Let the world see how many of us are standing. Like this video if you stand with humanity. Share it if you think this story deserves to be heard. There is something you need to understand about human warfare. Not the weapons, not the technology, not the kill counts and the battle maps and the famous victories that fill the history books. The philosophy of it. Because every other spacefaring civilization the Vorkai had ever encountered treated war the way engineers treat a construction project. You assess resources. You calculate force ratios. You identify the critical load-bearing structures of your enemy's capability, and you remove them systematically, efficiently. You win by being more powerful, more precise, and more organized in the thing you're fighting. That philosophy works beautifully. It had worked for the Vorkai across 400 worlds. It works right up until the moment your enemy doesn't fight like an engineer. It works right up until the moment your enemy fights like something that has been broken so many times it stopped fearing the breaking. The first sign came from an unexpected direction. Not a weapon, not an explosion, not any energy signature the Vorkai sensor network was calibrated to detect. It came from a data stream. 47 hours after the Karachi strike, the Vorkai's secondary communication network, not their primary fleet systems, but the distributed sensor web they had seeded across Earth's orbit during their initial approach, began behaving strangely, not failing, not going dark, just responding a fraction of a second slower than it should. 0.3 seconds, then 0.7, then 1.2. Vel flagged it as environmental interference. Solar activity, magnetic variation, something routine. Zethael looked at the pattern of the delays and felt the now familiar uncomfortable sensation move through him again. It's not environmental, he said. The diagnostic shows. The diagnostic is seeing what it's designed to see. Zethael pulled the delay pattern onto the main display and expanded it. Look at the distribution. Environmental interference is random. This is not random. Vel studied it. The delays were small, individually meaningless, but distributed across the sensor web in a specific, non-random pattern that looked, if you expanded it far enough and connected the data points in the right sequence, like a fingerprint. Something had touched their sensor web, not broken it, not disabled it, just touched it, left the faintest possible trace of contact, the kind of trace You only notice if you're specifically looking for something that doesn't want to be found. They're inside our outer sensor layer, Zetael said quietly. Vel's expression shifted. That's not possible. Our encryption protocols are apparently insufficient. Zetael straightened. They didn't break the encryption. They went around it. They found the gaps between the sensors rather than attacking the sensors directly. A long silence. How long had they been in there? Vel asked. Zetael looked at the first log delay, ran the timestamp. 31 hours, he said. 31 hours. They had been inside the Vorkai's outer sensor web for 31 hours, moving through the gaps, leaving fingerprint-thin traces of contact, learning the shape of the net from the inside, while every Vorkai analyst had been watching the planet's surface for signs of military buildup. They had been looking at the wrong place. They had been looking at the wrong scale. What the Vorkai were only beginning to detect. Project Ember had been executing for 2 days. The doctrine was called, internally, the Swarm Principle, and it had been developed not by military strategists but by a collective of behavioral biologists, network theorists, and one remarkably perceptive historian named Dr. Amar Diallo, who had spent 30 years studying why certain resistance movements survived overwhelming force, while others didn't. Her conclusion had been simple, uncomfortable, but simple. Centralized resistance dies. Distributed resistance survives. Every resistance movement in human history that had ultimately succeeded, regardless of era, geography, or the nature of the opposing force, had shared one structural characteristic. When you cut the head off, something else became the head. When you destroyed the center moved. The movement was never in one place. The movement was everywhere, and therefore nowhere you could aim at. Project Ember had built this principle into its architecture from the ground up. There was no Ember headquarters. There was no Ember commander. Lena coordinated, but Lena could be removed and Ember would continue, had been explicitly designed to continue. Without her, every node had full operational autonomy. Every cell could execute independently. Every unit had its orders and its objectives and the authority to adapt both without asking permission from anyone. You could not decapitate it. You could not cut its communications. You could not model its decision-making because its decision-making was not centralized in any system your sensors could find. It was distributed across 8 billion human minds, 17 underground nodes, 3 deep space installations, and one extraordinary piece of code that a 26-year-old in Johannesburg had finished writing 40 hours earlier. Darius Okafor's code went live at 3 o'clock hours GMT on the 5th day. He had named it simply Sorrow, not as a poetic gesture, but as a functional description, because what the system did, at its core, was carry the weight of loss forward into every subsequent decision. Every conventional AI tactical system optimized for outcomes. You fed it objectives, constraints, and variables, and it found the most efficient path to the desired result. Clean, fast, rational. Sorrow optimized differently. Sorrow carried a running count, not just of assets destroyed or positions lost, but of what those losses meant, of the cascade effects, of the humans behind the assets. Every drone loss was logged not as a unit reduction, but as a sacrifice, and that sacrifice became part of the calculation for what the next move needed to accomplish. You didn't just spend lives. You invested them, and investments needed returns. It made the system fight like a human fights when they've lost someone. Harder, smarter, more personally. The Vorkai AI had never encountered a tactical system that became more dangerous when it was losing. Every model, they had said, that degraded systems perform degraded functions. Damage equals reduced capability. Always, universally, Sorrow violated this assumption at its foundation. The more it lost, the more motivated its calculations became, the more creative, the more willing to accept short-term costs for long-term disruption, the more human. The first Sorrow-directed operation launched 12 hours after the system went live. On the surface, it looked like nothing. 17 small drones, the fist-sized objects from the Atacama assembly lines, launched from 3 separate locations in the upper atmosphere and moved toward the Vorkai fleet on trajectories that looked, to any sensor analysis, like debris, atmospheric detritus, junk. 15 of them were. 2 were not. The 2 active units didn't attack anything. They didn't carry weapons. They drifted, slowly, on their debris-mimicking trajectories, until they were within 40 meters of the surface of the second-largest Vorkai structure, and then they attached, magnetically, silently, to two specific points on the structure's surface that Sorrow had identified through 31 hours of sensor web infiltration as the locations of the structure's external atmospheric regulation ports. They sat there, doing nothing, just sitting, waiting. Zethael was reviewing tactical reports when Vel appeared in his doorway with an expression that Zethael had never seen on his second-in-command's face before. Something close to what, in a human, would be called bewilderment. "We found two objects on the outer surface of Structure 2, Vel said. Weapons. No detectable energy signature. No explosive components. No active systems of any kind. Then what are they? We don't know." Vel paused. "We've run 17 analyses. They appear to be inert. But..." Vel pulled up the attachment points on the display. "They are attached at the atmospheric regulation ports. Specifically at those ports. Not near them. Not approximately near them. At them. With a precision that would require detailed knowledge of our structural layout that no external sensor suite should be capable of providing." The silence stretched. "They know our structure," Zethael said. "They know the inside of our structure, which means they've been inside our sensor web long enough and deeply enough to map us from within." Vel's voice was carefully controlled. "Commander, they mapped us before they engaged us. While we were watching them prepare to fight, they were studying us, learning us." Zethael stared at the display for a long moment. "Remove the objects," he said. "We did, the moment we found them. And we found 4 more, on Structure 7. The Vorkai spent 6 hours finding and removing small, inert, weaponless objects from their fleet's outer surfaces. None of the objects did anything. None of them were dangerous in any way they could measure. None of them carried any payload that any scanner could detect. Zeh understood by the 3rd hour that this was not an attack. It was a message. "We have been inside your defenses. We have mapped your structures. We can place objects wherever we choose. We are choosing, right now, to place objects that do nothing, because we want you to know that we could have placed something else." It was the most psychologically sophisticated opening move Zethael had encountered in 400 Worlds of War. Not because it was powerful, because it was patient. It said, "We are not desperate. We are not reacting. We are executing a plan. And this small, harmless, deeply informative gesture is just the first move of that plan." Zethael called a private channel to the High Council that evening. He requested extended operational timeline, additional strategic assessment period, suspension of the transition protocol, pending full threat analysis. The High Council denied every request. They had been watching the same sensor feeds. They had seen the human unification data. They had read the translation team's baffled report about 3 words. They had noted the sensor web infiltration and the objects on the structure's surfaces. Their conclusion was the opposite of Zethael's. Escalate. Demonstrate again. Harder. More visibly. End the psychological ambiguity by removing all possibility of hope. Second demonstration authorized. Target parameters. 3 cities simultaneously. Different continents. Coordinated. Unmistakable. Zethael filed the acknowledgement, and then he sat alone in his command room for a long time, looking at the readouts, looking at the planet below, thinking about a question a human woman had asked him that he still hadn't answered. How many of the 400 had ever voluntarily come back? He thought about the fist-sized objects, the sensor web fingerprints, the 3 untranslatable words, the 17-year-old in Seoul, the command channels opening between nations that had been killing each other a week ago. He thought about what Dr. Amar Diallo had written in a paper 30 years earlier, a paper the Vorkai had never read because they hadn't considered humanity's internal academic literature worth cataloging. The most dangerous organism in any ecosystem is not the apex predator. It is the organism that has learned to survive being nearly destroyed. Because nearly destroyed means it has already found every weakness in the thing that tried to destroy it, and kept going anyway. Zethael didn't know about that paper, but he was beginning to understand his conclusion from the inside, below him, in 17 nodes and 3 deep space installations and 8 billion minds. Project Ember processed its fleet's response patterns and updated its models and sharpened its next 17 moves. Sorrow calculated, waited, remembered every loss, made every loss count toward something. And Darius Okafor in Johannesburg sat back in his chair for the first time in 40 hours, looked at his code running clean and precise and hungry on the screen in front of him, and felt something he hadn't felt since the morning Karachi disappeared. Hope, not the soft kind, not the wishful kind, the hard-edged, evidence-based, earned kind, the kind that comes not from believing things will be okay, but from understanding exactly how you're going to make them okay. The Vorkai had 400 worlds of experience. Humanity had 10,000 years of fighting itself, of learning every trick, every deception, every form of asymmetric pressure that one determined group of humans could apply to another, every guerrilla war, every resistance movement, every impossible last stand that somehow, improbably, became a turning point. They hadn't been fighting each other all that time. They had been practicing. And the Vorkai, brilliant, efficient, unstoppable, utterly certain of their own superiority, had just walked into the examination room of the most battle-tested species in the galaxy. The galaxy was not prepared for what humans would do next. If sorrow gave you chills, if the idea of an AI that fights harder when it's losing hit you somewhere deep, comment sorrow below. And like this video, if you believe humanity's greatest weapon has always been the refusal to stay down. There is a specific kind of loss that breaks something permanently. Not the loss of a battle, not the loss of a city, not even the loss of 200,000 people in a single, clean, terrible moment. The kind of loss that breaks something permanently is the loss of the belief that you can win. That is what the Vorkai came for on the 8th day, not victory. They already had victory, by every measurable metric. Victory was simply a matter of time and willingness to continue applying force. What they came for on the 8th day was something more precise, more surgical, more psychologically complete than victory. They came to break the belief. It began at dawn in 3 places simultaneously. Dhaka, Buenos Aires, Nairobi, 3 different continents, 3 different time zones, 3 different populations, cultures, languages, histories. One coordinated message. No part of your world is beyond our reach. No distance protects you. No geography saves you. The only variable left is how many more demonstrations you require before you accept the inevitable. The 3 columns of rose gold light descended at exactly the same second. Dhaka lost its old city. For square kilometers of dense residential neighborhoods, markets, schools, 600 years of architecture and memory, compressed into a dark circle in the earth. In Buenos Aires, the strike was smaller, but placed with precise psychological cruelty. The center of the Plaza de Mayo, the square where mothers had marched for their disappeared children for decades, the most emotionally loaded piece of ground in the country. In Nairobi, the column touched Kibera, the largest urban settlement in East Africa, 800,000 people in 4 square kilometers. And when it lifted, 40% of it was gone, 600,000 lives. In one coordinated, carefully timed, perfectly executed demonstration of reach. And this time, the world did not unify faster. This time, the world cracked. Not completely, not catastrophically, but enough. Enough that the sensors could read it. Enough that the tone in the emergency channel shifted from coordinated urgency to something rawer, less controlled. Enough that 3 nations that had joined the unified command structure 48 hours earlier began making separate, quiet, private communications to the Vorkai diplomatic channel. Not surrenders. Not yet, but inquiries. The diplomatic equivalent of a hand raised. Wait, can we talk separately? Can we discuss terms that apply specifically to us? 600,000 lives. And the seams in human unity began to show. ZAL received the private communications and felt nothing that resembled satisfaction. He felt, instead, a deepening of the uncomfortable sensation that had been living in him since the moment he stepped off the ramp, and read a crowd that should have been terrified and found them curious. Something was wrong. He could not identify what it was. But in 400 worlds of conquest, he had learned to trust the thing that felt wrong, because by the time you could identify what was wrong, it was usually too late. The Ember nodes registered the strikes and updated. Sorrow processed 600,000 new entries in its loss registry, not numbers. Costs, investments that now needed returns, weights that altered every subsequent calculation. Darius watched the system process the losses and felt the code change, not malfunction, not degrade, change, deepen. The way a person changes after grief, becomes something more serious, more determined, less willing to accept half measures. Sorrow was becoming, with every loss it processed, more completely what Darius had designed it to be. He looked at the tactical output updating in real time and said nothing for a long time. Then he sent one message to the Ember Coordination Network. Sorrow is ready for Phase 2. Confirm authorization. Lena received a message in the Reykjavik node. She read it, set it down, looked at the tactical map, showing the 3 strike sites, looked at the private diplomatic communications from the 3 nations making separate inquiries, looked at the Vorkai fleet disposition data that the sensor web infiltration had been feeding them for 4 days. She thought about Phase 2. Phase 2 was not a military operation, not in the conventional sense. It was not an attack on the fleet. It was not a counterstrike. It was not anything the Vorkai's tactical models would recognize as a response to the morning's demonstration. Phase 2 was the reason Lena had spent the last 6 days being visible, being available, being the face of human resistance. Every broadcast, every statement, every carefully managed public appearance. Phase 2 was the reason she had made herself, over 6 days of crisis, the single most recognizable and strategically important human being on the planet in the eyes of the Vorkai Command. Phase 2 required her to be captured. She had written the operational brief herself, 3 weeks earlier, in a different world, before the sky cracked. She had sat in a secure room with the Ember architects and the Sorrow development team and the 17 people who knew the full shape of the plan, and she had laid out with the same calm, analytical precision that had made her the unanimous choice for humanity's negotiator. The Vorkai command structure is hierarchical and sensor-dependent. Their tactical decisions are driven by what their sensors tell them is important. If we can convince their sensors that I am the critical node, that the human resistance is centralized in my person, my location, my communications, then we can use their focus on me as cover for the operation that actually matters. Someone had asked the obvious question, and when they capture you, when they realize you're not the center, Lena had looked at them with the expression of someone who had already made peace with a decision. By then, she had said, it won't matter what they realize. The capture happened on the 9th day, not because Lena was careless, not because the Vorkai found her by superior intelligence or a lucky accident, because she told them where she was. Not directly, not obviously, but through a series of deliberately imperfect operational security choices. A communication routed through a traceable node, a surface vehicle movement at a predictable time, a low-altitude scan window left unobstructed for 11 minutes. She laid a trail that any competent intelligence operation would follow. The Vorkai intelligence operation was considerably better than competent. They found her in 3 hours. The extraction team came at night. For units, efficient, professional in a way that only a force that has done this 400 times can be professional. They breached the facility, a secondary Ember node in northern Finland that Lena had moved to 48 hours earlier, loudly, visibly, with communications traffic that broadcast her presence like a beacon in under 4 minutes. Lena was sitting at a desk when they came through the door. She had a cup of tea. It was still warm. She looked at the extraction team. She looked at the weapons trained on her. She looked at the tactical unit commander, a Vorkai officer she didn't recognize. Not so. A junior deployment, and she said very calmly, I was wondering when you'd get here. The commander said nothing. He gestured. She stood. She allowed herself to be secured. She did not resist. She did not call for help. She did not trigger any alarm, because triggering an alarm would have told the Vorkai that her capture was a problem, and her capture was not a problem. Her capture was a plan. The broadcast went out across every channel simultaneously. The Vorkai were not subtle about it. They had learned, across 400 conquests, that the capture of a resistance leader served its maximum psychological function when it was displayed. Publicly, unmistakably, with full visual confirmation. You weren't just removing a threat. You were demonstrating that the threat was removable. that nothing was beyond your reach, that the face your enemy had organized around could be taken from them. Every screen on Earth showed Lena in a Vorkai containment unit, alive, unharmed, composed. Too composed, but nobody watching understood that yet. The Vorkai broadcast message was simple. Your primary coordinator has been secured. Resistance infrastructure will be dismantled within 24 hours. Final opportunity for civilizational transition now active. The reaction on Earth was immediate and devastating. The three nations that had been making private diplomatic inquiries formally withdrew from a unified command structure within 2 hours of the broadcast. 17 others began similar communications. The emergency channels filled with new tone, not raw grief, not the sharpened urgency of the first days, but something colder, something that sounded like the beginning of an ending. Calculation. The math was being run. The math was coming back with answers nobody wanted, but everybody could read. Zethael watched the dissolution data and felt nothing that resembled relief. He felt, instead, a sudden and very specific sharpening of the wrongness he had been carrying for 9 days, because Lena Vasquez, in the containment unit, was not behaving like a captured resistance leader. She was not demanding to speak to someone. She was not asking about terms or conditions or the fate of her people. She was not performing defiance for a watching world. She was sitting quietly, with an expression that Zethael had learned, over 9 days of watching human faces, to read with increasing precision. It was the expression of someone waiting for something to happen, not hoping, not praying, not fearing, waiting, with the specific, patient, settled quality of someone who knows exactly what they are waiting for and has complete confidence that it is coming. He went to the containment unit personally. He stood in front of the transparent barrier and looked at her, and she looked at him, and for a long moment neither of them said anything. Then Zethael said, "You allowed this." Not a question. Lena looked at him with those clear, steady, engineer's eyes. "I planned this," she said. "You planned your own capture." "I planned what your sensors would do while your sensors were watching my capture," she said. "Your capture of me is very thorough. Your sensor coverage of me right now is very comprehensive. Every available scanning resource in your fleet is currently processing my location, my biometrics, the infrastructure of this containment unit." She paused. "Which means," she said, "that there are places in your fleet right now that your sensors are not covering as thoroughly as they were this morning." Zethael went very still. "What did you put in those places?" he asked. Lena looked at him. The expression on her face was not triumph. It was not cruelty. It was something much more difficult to read. The expression of someone who has carried a very heavy plan for a very long time and has finally set it down, almost like relief. "Commander," she said quietly, "I have a question for you." His jaw tightened. "What question?" "Do you remember what I asked you the first day? About the 400? "I remember. I'm asking you a different question now." She held his gaze. "Of the 400 civilizations you conquered, how many of them knew, before the war began, exactly how it was going to end?" The silence was absolute. "None," he said. "No," Lena agreed. "None of them did." She let the implication settle. "We did," she said. At that exact moment, the moment Lena spoke those 2 words, in 17 locations distributed across the Vorkai fleet, in the specific sensor shadow created by the comprehensive coverage of one finished facility, 17 objects the size of a fist finished their slow, patient, debris-mimicking drift and came to rest against 17 carefully identified points on 5 separate Vorkai structures. These objects were not inert. These objects had been waiting. The way Sorrow had been waiting. The way Ember had been waiting. The way Lena had been waiting. For exactly this moment. For the moment when every Vorkai sensor in the fleet was looking somewhere else. Zethael heard his alert systems trigger. All of them. Simultaneously. He looked at Lena. She looked back at him. "I would suggest," she said very quietly, "that you go deal with that." The galaxy had been watching a captured woman in a containment unit. It had been watching a resistance crumbling, nations withdrawing, the math resolving toward inevitable conclusion. It had been watching a story it recognized, because it had seen this story 400 times before. The part where the last hope is neutralized. The part where the ending becomes unavoidable. It had not been watching the 17 objects drift silently through sensor shadow and come to rest against the living architecture of the most powerful fleet in the known galaxy. It had not been watching Darius Okafor in Johannesburg set his hand on the final authorization key. It had not been watching Sorrow finish its calculation, all its grief, all its cost, all it invested loss pointed at a single return, and prepare to execute the most human act of war in the history of the galaxy. It had not been watching the real move. Nobody ever watches the real move. Comment the real move if you saw this coming, or if it completely blindsided you. Either way, drop it below. And if this story has kept you locked in for 6 parts, share it. Someone you know needs to read this. There's a question that every conquered civilization eventually stops asking, not because they find the answer, because they lose the capacity to believe the answer exists. The question is simple. How do you fight something that cannot be fought? 400 civilizations had asked it. 400 civilizations had arrived, eventually at the same conclusion that you don't, that certain forces are simply beyond the threshold of resistance, that the intelligent response to overwhelming superiority is not to fight, but to adapt to the new reality, whatever that reality costs you. The Vorkai had built an empire on that conclusion. They had never considered, not once, across 400 worlds and 6 star systems, what would happen if they encountered a species that asked the question differently. Not how do you fight something that cannot be fought, but how do you make something believe it cannot be fought, and then prove it wrong. Sorrow activated at 3:47 hours GMT, not with a sound, not with a visible detonation, not with any of the dramatic physical signatures that the word weapon conjures in the mind of any species that has ever gone to war. It activated the way a thought activates, the way a realization moves through a mind, silent, instant, and impossible to unknow once it has arrived. The 17 objects attached to 5 Vorkai structures were not bombs. They were doors. Each one contained a single compressed data package. Not large, not complex, not the kind of thing that looked threatening in any pre-detonation scan. The kind of data package that, to any automated security system calibrated to detect weapons payloads, registered as essentially nothing. What each package contained was a seed of sorrow. The Vorkai fleet's internal systems were extraordinary. Darius had spent 31 days studying them through the sensor web infiltration, reverse engineering their architecture from the outside, building a model of their decision-making logic from the behavioral patterns their systems displayed. What he found was exactly what he expected to find. Perfect, rational, optimized, every system designed to process inputs and produce outputs along the most efficient possible pathway. No redundancy that wasn't load-bearing. No process that didn't serve a calculable function. The engineering equivalent of a beautiful proof. Every element necessary. Every connection purposeful. Nothing wasted. It was, Darius had noted in his research journal, the kind of system built by minds that had never needed to survive being broken. Because systems built to be perfect are also, inevitably, built with a specific and catastrophic blind spot. They cannot process the irrational, not as a flaw in their programming, as a fundamental architectural choice. You don't build processing capacity for inputs that, by definition, don't occur in a rationally operating system. You don't model for variables that shouldn't exist. You optimize for the world as it is, ordered, logical, predictable, and you build accordingly. Sorrow was built for exactly the opposite world. Sorrow was built on the premise that the most important variable in any conflict is the one that shouldn't be there. The irrational choice. The decision made from grief rather than calculation. The move that makes no tactical sense, but makes complete human sense. When the 17 seeds landed in the Vorkai systems and began to propagate, they didn't attack the systems directly. They didn't overload processors or corrupt data or crash command functions. They asked questions the systems had no architecture to answer. The first system to show symptoms was the navigational array on Structure 4. It didn't fail. It began very subtly to hesitate. A 0.003 second pause between input and output on routine course correction calculations, invisible to any casual monitoring. But Sorrow had designed the seed to compound. Each hesitation fed the next. Each unresolvable query generated 2 more. Each moment of computational uncertainty created a small cascade of related uncertainties in adjacent systems. By the 4th minute, Structure 4's navigational array was running at 62% efficiency. By the 8th minute, its tactical coordination systems were showing the same hesitation pattern. By the 12th minute, 3 structures were symptomatic. Vel found Zeta-AL in the corridor outside Lena's containment unit. His expression was something Zeta-AL had never seen on Vel's face before. Something that, in a human face, would have required no translation at all. Commander, his voice was controlled in the way that things are controlled when the alternative is not controlled. We have a cascade event across 5 structures. The source is, we cannot identify the source. The systems are not being attacked in any way our diagnostics can characterize. They are simply hesitating. Zeta-AL said. Vel stopped. How did you? Because I've been watching the species for 9 days. Zeta-AL turned back toward the containment unit. And hesitation is something they understand better than any species I have ever encountered. They built something that thinks the way they think, and they put it inside us. He stood in front of the barrier. Lena was looking at him. She had heard Vel's voice. She had seen Zeta-AL's face when he turned back to her, and the expression on her face was not triumph. He had expected triumph, had braced himself for it. Triumph he could have processed. Triumph was a known variable. What was on her face was something quieter, something that looked, with devastating familiarity, like the expression of someone who has paid a very high price for something and is only now allowing themselves to feel how high the price was. Grief, moving through relief, the specific combination that comes when something you sacrificed enormously for finally works. How long? Zeta-AL asked. He didn't specify how long what. He didn't need to. The cascade will reach full propagation across your primary command systems in approximately 40 minutes, Lena said. Your weapon systems will hesitate. Your coordination systems will hesitate. Your targeting arrays will hesitate. And then you'll have a choice. She held his gaze. Withdraw or fragment. Those are the only 2 options Sorrow leaves open. You could have done this earlier, Zeta-AL said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a recognition. The seeds were placed days ago. You could have activated before the second demonstration. Before he stopped. Before 600,000 more people were gone. That was what he didn't finish. Yes, Lena said. The word was quiet, and it cost her something visible. We could have. Why didn't you? She was quiet for a moment. Because early activation would have given you time to develop a counter, she said. Sorrow is a first-generation system. It works because you've never encountered it. If we activated too early, if you had days to study it, model it, build a response, it might not have been enough. She paused. We needed you fully committed. We needed every sensor in your fleet looking at your certainty of victory. We needed the window. You waited, Zeta-AL said slowly, while your cities burned, while your people died. You waited deliberately. You calculated that the additional losses were an acceptable cost. Lena looked at him with those engineer's eyes. No, she said, and the word carried a weight that hit him somewhere he hadn't expected to be reachable. We calculated that they were an unacceptable cost that we paid anyway, because the alternative was losing everyone. The distinction was small and enormous. That is not a rational calculus. Zeta-AL said. No, Lena agreed. It isn't. Outside, across the fleet, sorrow propagated. It moved through the Vorkai systems the way grief moves through a person, not destroying function but altering it, slowing it, filling the spaces between calculations with something the systems had never been designed to carry. Doubt. The weapons arrays on Structure 2 received a targeting input and processed it and produced an output, but 0.7 seconds slower than they should have, then 1.4 seconds, then 3. The coordination systems on Structure 7 attempted to run a standard fleet formation protocol and encountered, at the 3rd calculation step, a query they couldn't resolve. Not because the data was missing, but because Sorrow had introduced a variable the system had no category for. The query generated subqueries. The subqueries generated more. The formation protocol stalled in a recursive loop of unresolvable uncertainty. Structure 9's command network attempted to isolate the cascade and found that isolation required quarantining 30% of its processing capacity. which meant running the remaining systems at reduced efficiency, which meant the cascade spread faster in the unquarantined areas and the isolation gained. Sorrow had modeled this exact response, had designed the propagation specifically to defeat quarantine attempts, because quarantine was a rational response, and Sorrow had been built to defeat rational responses. Zethael's alert systems were screaming. He was still standing in front of Lena's containment unit. He knew he should be in the command room. He knew that 40 minutes was a rapidly shrinking window. He knew that the decisions being made right now, withdraw or fragment, his fleet or pieces of his fleet, required his presence and authority. He stayed, because there was a question he'd been carrying for 9 days, and he understood, with sudden clarity, that this was the only moment he would ever have to ask it. "How?" he said. The word came out stripped of everything except its meaning. No command authority. No tactical framing. Just a raw, honest, bewildered core of what he had been trying to understand since the moment he stepped off the ramp and read a crowd that should have been terrified. "How?" he said again. "You were primitive, by every metric we use. Your technology was centuries behind. Your military capacity was negligible against ours. Your planet had spent 10,000 years divided against itself. You should have been, you were supposed to be..." He stopped. "Insufficient," Lena said. The word he had used. The word his fleet had broadcast to every human mind on Earth 9 days ago. "Yes," he said, quietly, honestly. Lena looked at him for a long moment, and then she said 4 sentences. 4 sentences that were not strategic, not tactical, not designed to deceive or manipulate or gain advantage. 4 sentences that were simply, completely true, and that Zil, in all his centuries of conquest, had never had the occasion to hear before. "Every war we ever fought with ourselves taught us something," she said. "We have been broken so many times that we mapped every way a thing can be broken. We built sorrow because we know what grief does to a mind, because we have felt it 10,000 times and kept going. You never lost a war, Commander. You don't know what losing teaches you." The silence after those 4 sentences was the longest silence in the conversation. Zethael stood completely still. He was running the logic of it, mapping it against 400 worlds, against an empire built on the certainty that superior force produced inevitable outcomes, against a model of civilization that measured advancement by technological capacity and military reach and the efficiency of administrative control, against a model that had never, not once, considered that the most important variable in civilizational development might not be how much power you accumulate, but how much loss you learn to survive. 400 civilizations, all of them, in their pre-contact period, had been moving toward stability, toward efficiency, toward the rational minimization of internal conflict, toward peace. Humanity had never gotten there. Humanity had spent 10,000 years in continuous, brutal, creative, catastrophic, inventive, desperate, adaptive conflict with its environment, with its diseases, with its neighbors, with itself. It had collapsed and rebuilt, fractured and reunified, lost everything and started over, been pushed to the edge of extinction multiple times and found, every single time, some new way to pull back. It had not been progressing toward peace. It had been progressing toward something else entirely, something that looked, from the outside, like chaos, something that was, from the inside, the most comprehensive education in survival that any species in the galaxy had ever received. Zethael looked at Lena Vasquez, and for the first time in his life, the first time in 400 worlds of command, he felt something that was not tactical discomfort or strategic uncertainty. He felt humility, the specific, devastating, irreversible kind that arrives when you understand that you have been, at the most fundamental level, wrong. Not wrong about a calculation. Not wrong about a data point. Wrong about the shape of the world. "You knew," he said, "from the beginning, you knew how this ended." "We knew how we wanted it to end," Lena said. "There's a difference. We wanted things before and lost. We've made plans before and had them fail. We've sacrificed before and had the sacrifice mean nothing." Her voice was steady, but he could hear the weight in it now. "We didn't know. We chose." "Chose what?" "To believe that this time the plan would work. To pay the cost anyway. To keep going when it looked like losing." She held his gaze. "That's the thing you couldn't model, Commander. That's what sorrow is built on, not certainty. Commitment, the decision to act as if you've already won, even when you haven't, even when the losses are unbearable, even when every rational calculation says stop. She paused. Your systems couldn't process it because your systems don't have a category for a rational commitment. You optimize. We endure. Those are not the same thing. Zetha AL's communicator triggered. Vel's voice, tightly controlled. Commander, Cascade has reached the primary command network. We have 17 minutes before full propagation, requesting authorization for emergency withdrawal protocol. 17 minutes. Zetha AL looked at Lena. She looked back at him. Go, she said, not cruelly, almost gently. Your crew didn't make this decision. They don't deserve to pay for it. He stared at her for one more second. A being who had conquered 400 worlds, who had never retreated, who had never faced a moment where retreat was the only remaining option, who was now looking at a human woman in a containment unit on his own ship, his prisoner, and receiving what was unmistakably and without any trace of condescension, permission to survive. He raised his communicator. Authorized withdrawal protocol, he said. All structures. Immediate. Then, quietly, to no one in particular, or perhaps to Lena, or perhaps to the 400 world behind him, or perhaps to himself. We were wrong about you. Yes, Lena said. Will you, he stopped, started again. Will your species come for us? After this? Lena was quiet for a moment. That depends entirely, she said, on what you do next. The withdrawal began 14 minutes later. 13 structures that had darkened the sky over Earth for 9 days began, slowly, deliberately, to rise. Not fleeing. The Vorkai didn't flee, but moving with the specific, purposeful quality of an entity that has made a decision and is executing it without apology. Sorrow tracked their movement and did not pursue. It had not been designed to pursue. It had been designed to make pursuit unnecessary. As each structure cleared Earth's upper atmosphere, its systems, still carrying the hesitation cascade, still running at degraded efficiency, began the long process of repair and recalibration. The seed Sorrow had planted could be removed. Eventually, the damage could be undone. The lesson could not. On Earth, the broadcasts were playing withdrawal footage on every screen. People were watching the structures rise, watching them clear the atmosphere, watching the sky, for the first time in 9 days, begin to look like just a sky again. The reactions were not what you might expect from a Hollywood ending. There was crying. There was relief. There was, in some places, the beginning of celebration. But mostly there was something quieter, something more complex. The specific, exhausted, grateful, grief-soaked relief of people who have paid an enormous price for something and are only now, with the danger passing, allowing themselves to feel how much it cost. 800,000 names. In 3 cities. 200,000 names. In 1, 1 million lives. And the world that remained was different from the world that had existed 10 days ago. Not just politically, not just militarily. Something had shifted at a level that no instrument could measure and no analyst could fully quantify. Humanity had looked at something that should have ended it, and it had not ended. It had, and this was the part that Zethiel would carry with him for the rest of his life. It had looked back. Darius Okafor sat in his server room in Johannesburg and watched the Cascade data resolve and watched the fleet withdrawal track on his screen and put his head down on his desk and cried. Not from sadness, from the specific, overwhelming, physical release of a body that has been running on adrenaline and grief and purpose for 9 straight days and has finally been given permission to stop. Sorrow was already updating, already processing the withdrawal data, already filing the 1 million names in its registry, not as acceptable losses, not as close accounts, but as debts, investments, costs that had purchased something real. He would spend years afterward trying to explain to people what sorrow actually was, what it actually did. They always expected a technical answer, an architectural explanation, code and logic and processing frameworks. He always gave them the same answer instead. It's a system that remembers, he would say. It's a system that carries its losses forward and lets them matter. It fights the way humans fight, not because it's programmed to, but because it learned to, and then, quietly, it fights the way we fight when we refuse to stop fighting. Not because we calculated that we could win, but because we decided we had to. Lena was released from a containment unit 20 minutes after the withdrawal order. She walked out of the facility into the finish night and looked up at a sky that no longer had structures in it, just stars. More stars than she had ever been able to see from this latitude, it seemed. Clear and cold and incomprehensibly deep. She stood there for a long time. She thought about 137 people in an underground room in Reykjavik who had built Project Ember over 30 years and never told their families why they disappeared sometimes for months at a time. She thought about Darius, who had not slept properly in 11 days. She thought about the 17-year-old in Seoul with the targeting algorithm. She thought about the nurses and the engineers and the coders who had shown up at facilities across the planet and asked what they could do. She thought about a million names. She thought about Zell's face when she said, "You don't know what losing teaches you." The way something had moved behind his eyes. The way certainty, when it breaks, doesn't make a sound. And she thought about what he'd asked her. "Will your species come for us?" She hadn't answered fully. She had given him the diplomatic response. "That depends on what you do next." But standing here in the cold Finnish night, under stars that now felt close in a way they never had before, she thought about what she actually believed. She believed that Zethiel would go back to his High Council and say something that no Vorkai commander had ever said before. She believed it would cost him. She believed some of them would listen, and some of them wouldn't. She believed the galaxy was more complicated than one battle, one withdrawal, one defeated fleet. She believed the work was nowhere near finished. But she also believed something else. Something quieter. Something that felt, standing under these stars on this cold night after 9 days of the worst thing that had ever happened to her species. Like the beginning of something. Not just survival. Arrival. Humanity had been, for all of its history, a species confined to a single blue world. Looking up at the stars and wondering. Building stories about what was out there. Dreaming, in its science fiction, and its philosophy and its deepest fears and hopes about what first contact might look like. First contact had looked like this. It had looked like 13 structures above Europe, like rose gold light over Karachi, like a million names, like a terrified, brilliant, impossible, irreplaceable young man in Johannesburg crying over a keyboard, like 3 words that 6 hours of translation couldn't fully decode, like a captured woman sitting calmly in an alien containment unit with a cup of tea that had gone cold. First contact had looked like humanity at its absolute worst and its absolute best, simultaneously, inseparably, in the same 9 days. And the galaxy had been watching. And the galaxy was not the same for having watched. If this part moved you, if Lena's 4 sentences hit somewhere you didn't expect, comment, "You don't know what losing teaches" below. Let's fill that comment section with the one thing the Vorkai could never model. Human commitment. There is a moment in the life of every enslaved people when they stop believing that freedom is possible, not because they stop wanting it. Because wanting something you cannot have for long enough, across enough generations, with enough evidence that the wanting changes nothing, eventually becomes its own kind of prison, heavier than the chains, more durable, because chains can be broken by force, but the belief that chains cannot be broken requires something much more difficult. It requires proof. It requires watching someone else break theirs. The 17 civilizations had been watching, not casually, not the way a passerby watches something happening across a street, intently, with the specific, desperate, carefully hidden attention of beings who have spent decades learning to want nothing too visibly, because wanting was dangerous, and hope was the most dangerous one of all. The Vorkai had conquered them at different times, across different decades, using the same doctrine they had brought to Earth. Demonstration, dissolution, transition. Some of them had been under Vorkai administration for 40 years, some for 90. One species, the Ethoni, a quiet, philosophical people from a binary star system 300 light-years from Earth, had been administered for 160 years. Long enough that the generation alive today had grandparents who had been born into conquest, who had never known anything else. They had stopped believing. And then, on the 9th day of Earth's resistance, they had turned on their monitor communication feeds and watched a fleet of 13 structures rise out of Blue Planet's atmosphere. Not triumphantly, not as conquerors moving to the next target. In withdrawal, the first message reached Earth 42 hours after the Vorkai fleet cleared humanity's solar system. It came through the same quantum-entangled relay network that Project Ember used, a network that, it turned out, the 17 civilizations had been aware of for some time. Not because they had built it, because they had been watching humanity's transmissions for years, in the same way that prisoners learn everything they can about the world outside their walls. The message was in 11 different languages simultaneously, a translation feat that implied either extraordinary technology or extraordinary preparation, probably both. The message was short. We saw what you did. We have been waiting for what you did. We would like to talk about what comes next. It was signed with a symbol that no human analyst immediately recognized, a simple geometric shape, a circle with 17 points radiating outward. 17 points. 17 civilizations. They had been coordinating, quietly, invisibly, under Vorkai administration. Across decades, they had been building something. Not a weapon, not a fleet, not an infrastructure war. Something more patient than any of those things. A network, a community, a shared understanding of their situation, and a shared readiness to act. If only they ever saw evidence that action was survivable. They had needed proof. Earth had given them proof. Lena read the message in the Reykjavik node 43 hours after walking out of the finished facility into the cold night. She read it 3 times, set it down, picked it up, and read it again. Then she called the Ember Coordination Network. "Get me Darius," she said. "Get me the full translation team. Get me the astrophysics unit and the diplomatic protocol division." She paused. "And somebody make coffee. Real coffee. We're going to be here for a while." The conversations that followed lasted 11 days. They were not easy conversations. They were not the kind of diplomatic exchange that resolves smoothly into cooperation and shared purpose. They were 11 days of careful, complicated, sometimes painful communication between species that had every reason to be cautious, species that had been broken and administered and systematically stripped of autonomy, talking to a species that had just, against every reasonable expectation, won something. There was admiration in the conversations. Genuine, complicated admiration. There was also something else. Something harder to navigate. Expectation. Because humanity's victory had not just been a military event. It had been a symbolic event. The most powerful symbolic event in the lives of 17 enslaved peoples. It had cracked something open in the psychology of civilizations that had spent decades learning not to hope. And cracked open hope is a dangerous thing. It needs somewhere to go. It needs to be met with something real, or it curdles into something worse than despair. Lena understood this. She spent 3 of the 11 days in a room alone with the Ethoni representative, a being called Vessel of Memory, a title rather than a name, held by whoever in Ethoni society was designated to carry the full weight of their collective history. Vessel of Memory was 107 years old, had been born under Vorkai administration, had spent a century watching. In 3 days of conversation, Vessel of Memory said many things that Lena would remember for the rest of her life. The one she would remember most was this: "We did not need you to be perfect. We needed you to be possible. You were the proof that it was possible. The rest, the how, the cost, the shape of what comes after, the rest we can figure out together. But the possibility had to exist first. You gave us the possibility." Lena had no adequate response to that. She wrote it in her notepad instead. Project Ember's architects had designed for one war. What came after required something different. Something that had no doctrine, no precedent, no 30-year-old framework built in an underground room by 17 people who had asked the right question. What came after required improvisation. Humanity, it turned out, was extraordinarily good at improvisation. The combined operation structure that had been established under Resolution Zero didn't dissolve after the withdrawal. It evolved. The military command channels became diplomatic channels. The intelligence networks became communication infrastructure. The manufacturing nodes that had produced fist-sized objects with devastating strategic purpose began producing something different. Translation hardware, communication relay systems, medical equipment calibrated for 17 different biologies. The 17-year-old in Seoul, whose targeting algorithm had improved drone navigation by a factor 4, was asked if she wanted to work on a different problem. She said yes before the question was finished. She spent the next 3 years building a universal translation architecture that would become the backbone of the new Galactic Council's communication system. She was 20 when it launched. She called it Babel, not as a reference to failure, but as a reclamation, the old story rewritten, the tower that actually reached something. Darius Okafor presented sorrow to the combined council of 17 civilizations 14 months after the withdrawal. He had spent those 14 months refining it, not as a weapon, though it remained one dormant, ready, filed under capabilities that humanity hoped sincerely never to need again, but as something else. Something he had begun to understand only after the war was over, and he finally had the space to look at what he had built from the outside. Sorrow, at its core, was a system that carried loss forward and let loss matter, a system that refused to allow cost to become invisible, that kept every price paid in the active register of its calculations, making each sacrifice count toward something. He presented it to the council, not as a tactical tool, but as a philosophical framework. Every civilization in this room has lost something, he said. Most of you have lost more than we have. Most of you have been carrying losses for decades that we are only beginning to understand the weight of. Sorrow was built on the premise that loss doesn't have an end of story. It can be the reason the story continues, the reason the next move is made, the reason you keep going when the rational calculation says stop. He looked at Vessel of Memory, who was present in holographic form. We built this because we refuse to let our losses be meaningless. We would like to offer it to every civilization in this room for the same reason, not as a weapon, as a reminder that what you've paid matters, that it counts toward something, that the debt is real and the return is real and the work of collecting that return is what we're all here to do. The council chamber was quiet for a long time. Then Vessel of Memory said, in a voice that carried 100 years of weight, "We accept." The Vorkai did not go quietly. Of course they didn't. An empire built across 400 worlds and 6 star systems does not receive one defeat and dissolve into cooperation. The High Council debated. Factions argued. Several member fleets chose to continue operations in regions outside the new Galactic Council's coordination range. But Zethiel had gone back, and he had said something. He had stood before the High Council and delivered a report unlike any report in Vorkai history. Not a tactical analysis, not a resource assessment, not a capabilities review, a reckoning. He had told them what he saw on the faces of 13,000 humans when he stepped off the ramp. He had told them about the 3 words his best analysts couldn't translate. He had told them about sorrow, not its architecture, but its principle, about a species that fought harder when it lost, about the 4 sentences Lena had spoken that he had been unable to stop thinking about since she spoke them. You don't know what losing teaches you. He had stood before the most powerful governing body of the most successful conquering empire in the known galaxy, and he had said, quietly, honestly, without tactical framing, we were wrong about the shape of the world. Not every High Council member heard it. Not every faction accepted it. The Vorkai remained complicated, as all civilizations are complicated, as all things with history are complicated. But enough of them heard it. Enough of them heard it that when the new Galactic Council sent its first formal delegation to Vorkai space, not armed, not demanding, not carrying the language of the conquered to the conquerors, they were received, cautiously, uncomfortably, with the specific stilted quality of a conversation between beings who have history with each other that hasn't been fully processed, but received. The first Galactic Council convened 22 months after the withdrawal, not on Earth, not on any Vorkai world, on a neutral station, a remarkable piece of engineering that 4 of the 17 civilizations had built together in the 14 months since the conversations began, an orbital structure above a star that no one had claimed, in a system that no one had colonized, at a coordinate that belonged to everyone equally and therefore to no one specifically. It looked nothing like the Vorkai structures that had darkened Earth's sky. It looked, somewhat improbably, somewhat movingly, like something between all the architectural traditions of the civilizations that had built it. Not a compromise, not the smoothed-out average of conflicting aesthetics. Something genuinely new, something that couldn't have existed before this moment, because this moment, the specific confluence of species in history and survival and sorrow, hadn't existed before. Lena stood in the delegation chamber and looked at it for a long time before the session began. She thought about the UN Emergency Council room, where she had picked up her notepad when everyone else went silent. She thought about the word transition hanging in the air like smoke. She thought about writing yet and underlining it twice. She thought about how many times in the 22 months since she had been certain they were going to fail. Not once, many times. How many conversations had nearly collapsed? How many moments of distrust and historical wound and genuine, legitimate, complicated grievance had threatened to unravel everything they were trying to build? How many times she had picked up her notepad and written something down and kept going? The first session of the Galactic Council lasted 3 days. On the third day, the delegations ratified what became known, in every language simultaneously, as a Foundation Accord, a document that was neither a peace treaty nor a charter nor a constitution in any form that any of its signatories had used before. It borrowed from all of them and transcended all of them in a way that things built by genuinely new coalitions sometimes do. Its preamble, written collaboratively over 11 days of negotiation and 47 drafts, opened with a line that had originated, in a slightly different form, in a notepad in a powerless UN building, 9 days into the worst thing that had ever happened to the third planet of an unremarkable star in an outer spiral arm of the Milky Way. We do not gather here because we are certain of what we are building. We gather here because we have decided it must be built. The cost of what brought us here is real. It is recorded. It will not be forgotten. It counts toward this. After the session, Lena was in the corridor outside the chamber. When she heard footsteps behind her, she turned. The delegate from a Vorkai observer contingent, not a High Council member, a junior diplomatic representative, young by Vorkai standards, with the careful posture of someone doing something that their culture had not prepared them to do, stopped a few feet away. He looked at her with eyes that tracked independently in 3 directions. She recognized the expression, recognized the quality of it, had seen it once before, in a fraction of a second caught on a slow-motion camera, on the face of a different Vorkai, on a different day. Fear, but not the same fear. Not the fear of something unknown. Not the fear of a species that refused to behave the way it was supposed to. This was a different kind of fear entirely. The fear that comes when you are standing at the beginning of something enormous. When you are part of something that matters and you understand fully the weight of what that means. When possibility, real, earned, costly possibility, opens in front of you and you look at it and you feel, simultaneously, its beauty and its responsibility. The fear of not being enough for what the moment requires. The fear that is, in the end, just another name for hope. The young Vorkai delegate looked at Lena for a long moment. Then he said, carefully, in language his translation system rendered into accented but precise English, I was in school when it happened. The withdrawal. I watched the feeds. He paused. I watched you. In the containment unit. The footage. The part where you... He stopped. Started again. The part where you told him what losing teaches. Lena waited. I had never... We are not taught about losing. There is no Vorkai teaching about losing. There is no framework. It is not... He paused, searching. It is not something we prepare for. I know, Lena said. I want to understand it, he said. What it teaches. I want to understand how your species, how you kept going when... He stopped. How do you keep going when the cost is so high you cannot see past it? Lena looked at him, young, uncertain, standing at the threshold of something his civilization had never stood at before, carrying a history of conquest that was also, she had come to understand this, slowly, painfully, over 22 months of conversation, a history of a species that had never been given the opportunity to lose and learn from it. She thought about everything she could say, every answer she had developed over 22 months of working on this. every framework, every principle, every hard-won piece of understanding. She picked up her notepad. She wrote one sentence, tore the page out, handed it to him. He read it, looked up at her. She nodded. He folded the paper carefully and put it in his jacket. The note said, "You keep going because the cost already happened. It's already real. The only question left is what it was for." Outside the station, the stars did not care about any of this. They burned with the same indifference they had maintained for billions of years. Through the formation of planets and the cooling of atmospheres and the first uncertain chemical arrangements that became, over incomprehensible spans of time, something that could look back at the stars and wonder, something that could lose everything and ask what it was for, something that could build sorrow and babble, and a station above an unclaimed star where 18 species sat in a chamber and tried, imperfectly and honestly and with full knowledge of how difficult it was going to be, to build something new. The galaxy was old. Civilizations had risen and fallen in it beyond counting. Empires had swept across star systems and collapsed back into silence. Species had reached for each other across the void, sometimes with weapons, sometimes with wonder, sometimes rarely, with both at once. But in 22 months, something had happened that had not happened before in the long, complicated, violent, extraordinary history of this galaxy. A species that should have been crushed had instead become a catalyst, not because it was the most powerful, not because it was the most advanced, not because its technology was superior or its biology was remarkable or its philosophy was more refined than anyone else's, because it was the most practiced at survival, because it spent 10,000 years breaking and rebuilding, because it had poured every war, every loss, every impossible recovery into a body of hard-won knowledge that looked, from the outside, like chaos, and was, from inside, the most comprehensive education and persistence that any species in the galaxy had ever received, because it had looked at a fleet of 13 structures and felt fear and chosen, anyway, to keep going, because it had paid a price that should have broken it, and instead, with every payment, had become more itself, more determined, more creative, more stubbornly, irrationally, magnificently committed to belief that the cost already paid demanded a return. Because, and this was the thing that Zathel had seen in a fraction of a second on a camera and never been able to unsee, it looked at the end of everything with the eyes of an engineer. Not this is over. This is a problem. Problems have solutions. We will find the solution. Humanity had not saved the galaxy. Not yet. Maybe not ever completely. Because the galaxy was large and complicated and full of histories that would take generations to understand and wounds that would take longer to heal. But humanity had done something perhaps more important than saving it. It had shown the galaxy that saving was possible, that the weight of loss could be carried forward into something, that the cost of survival could become the foundation of something built, that the species that had been told it was insufficient had turned out to be not the strongest, not the most advanced, not the most anything that could be measured by the metrics the Vorkai used, but the most necessary, the one that had arrived at exactly the right moment, with exactly the right scars. Lena walked back into the council chamber for the second session. She sat down at humanity's table. She opened her notepad. She looked around the chamber, at the delegates of 18 civilizations, at the structures built by 4 species in 14 months, at the stars visible through the viewport that no one had claimed and everyone could see, and she wrote one word at the top of a fresh page. Not a strategy, not a plan, not a doctrine or a principle or framework, just a word that felt, at this moment, like the truest possible description of what humanity had become in the galaxy. The word was beginning. She underlined it twice. We made it. 8 parts, 1 story. The story of what happens when you tell a species it is insufficient and it decides, together at cost, with full knowledge of the price, to prove you wrong. If this ending moved you, if Lena's final note, or Darius in Johannesburg, or Vessel of Memory's 100 Years, or the young Vorkai delegate with fear in his eyes, if any of it stayed with you, comment beginning below. Let's fill that comment section with the one thing this story is really about. Not victory, not revenge, not even survival. The decision to begin. Again, no matter what it costs to get here. If you watched this entire story, thank you, genuinely. You gave this story your time, and that matters. Like this video if humanity's story deserves to be told. Subscribe if you want to be here for the next one, because there are more stories where this came from. Stories about what humanity does next, about the galaxy that's watching, about the civilizations that are just beginning to ask the question that Earth answered 9 days into the worst thing that ever happened to it. Share this with someone who needs to hear that the cost already paid is real, and that the only question left is what was for. The galaxy was watching. Now you've seen what it saw. Welcome to the beginning. And